everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of the upcoming trade paperback Brooklyn Blood, as well as a rather notable figure from the history of DC Comics. It's Paul Levitz. Thanks for coming on, Paul.
Thanks for having me, David.
So, we're going to talk about your new release, the collection of your Dark Horse Presents series, Brooklyn Blood, here in a little bit, but I want to start by diving into your career quite a bit, because you've had a heck of one. I mean, this year you're up for the Eisner Hall of Fame, which I have to say, man, you have some stiff competition this year.
Yeah, I think it might be a little premature. I don't know if I'm ready to be sealed in Mylar and put away yet.
You're not going to be bagged and boarded?
But it's a hell of an honor just to be nominated.
Yeah, it's quite the list of folks. But I do want to start with a topic that's come up several times on this show before. These days, people love to give people guff who write about comics for the idea that the only reason why they write about comics is because they're trying to get a foot in the door to work in comics itself. And I always like to say that's not new. I mean, Paul Levitz made fanzines before he worked for DC. But I want to start with the fanzines. You started your first one when you were like 11 or 12, right?
Well, that depends on what you count as a first fanzine. I mean, I did the first, you could call them fanzines. I did little things using carbon paper to make multiple copies for,
sure,
a couple of friends at bungalow colonies in upstate New York when I was probably 12. The first fanzines I did that any human being who hadn't met me read, I was 14.
Mm-hmm. And was that when you had bought and taken over the comic reader?
Well, not initially. A friend of mine, Paul Kupperberg, and I started a fanzine called Etc. that was in many ways modeled on what the comic reader had been, but the comic had fallen into abeyance by that point. Don and Maggie Thompson had announced they were going to be giving up Newfangles. And we said, oh, God, we're not going to know what's going on. And with the courage and foolishness that only youth can bring, I was 14, he was 15. We threw together $16 and started a fanzine, called up DC, called up Marvel, cribbed some things from Newfangles and other existing fanzines. And we did that for a few months. The other Paul dropped out. He had other things he was doing with his life at that moment. I stuck with it. And after I'd been doing it for about half a year, Mark Hannerfeld, who had been the last editor of the comic reader, came up to me with his big manila envelope full of quarters and nickels and index cards with subscribers' names on it and said, here, you're doing what I set out to do. Why don't you take all my old subscribers and take all the money and just do it?
Whoa.
And instantly it went from being a circulation of a couple of hundred probably to over 1,000, and probably was the largest circulation fanzine that had content in it at the time on a regular basis.
And so for listeners that don't know, the comic reader was largely, I mean, you look it up and basically people equated it to TV Guide. It was like where people got information about comics. And it's funny because I'm doing this podcast from Anchorage, Alaska, and like we're living in this decentralized time where you can be anywhere doing anything and get all this information because we have the internet. But then you were like pasting things up. You were getting the information directly from the sources, and you were in a lot of ways, comic reader was one of the only ways you could find out this information before it actually came out, right? Like that was one of the rare places you could find that info.
Well, publishers weren't announcing when comics were going to come out in advance. They weren't announcing credits. They didn't put credits on the stories.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons that I developed good relationships with so many of the creative people in the field was that they were finding out when their own work would get published.
Wow.
You would do a story for a mystery comic. You'd never know when it was coming. Often the publishers didn't bother sending you copies. And a lot of the older guys didn't care too much about that, but some of them did. And a lot of the younger guys cared an awful lot. They wanted to get copies of their own material. So I made a lot of friends. When you talk about the difference in the time and being in Alaska, a lot of the reason it was possible to do this is that at that point the comic book industry was really small. There were maybe 200 creative people working in American comics,
Mm-hmm.
and about 95% of them were in the New York metro area. So you could reach and connect into this community in ways that you just could never do today.
Yeah, I mean that is one of the things that it's become decentralized, not just in how the information is disseminated, but also like even DC Comics moved over to California, which was, I mean, for a long time everything was, the main publishers were based out of New York, the creators, as you said, were based out of New York. It's definitely changed a lot, but that certainly made it a little bit easier for you. I do have to ask, like, this is one of the things when I was reading about your experience of running these fanzines and doing all of that was, what did your parents think about this? Like, how did they take this idea of, hey, I'm going to run over to DC Comics so I can report on this fanzine that I have to mail out to all these people and effectively make a fairly successful business in the process?
Well, they were befuddled by it to some extent, but they were very supportive. I was 14 when I started. I needed a cosigner on a checking account.
Mm-hmm.
Get one. My mom had been a bookkeeper in her earlier life, so she was helpful in doing some keeping track of the numbers and subscriptions and things like that. After the business was running for a little while, we lived in a one-family house that had a studio apartment in the basement that they rented out. I said, "Look, I need the space. Can you throw out the tenant? I'll pay the rent." And they kind of scratched their head and said, "Okay, I guess so." And at 15, I had this studio apartment as a working studio for putting the magazines together.
Mm-hmm.
It was, my dad would run me over to the printer to pick up the copies to bring back to the house to have my friends over to collate them and put mailing labels on. So they were terrific that way.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, I have to admit, researching all this made me feel like a huge slacker. Just reading about all the stuff you had to do to make. I mean, because today it's just like you can have a website where you just create on WordPress and everything like that. But you were pacing everything up. You were gathering the news from the varying publishers, writing the articles, everything, and then also having to mail it all out. I mean, it's kind of, looking back on it, it was. I'm guessing it was a lot of work actually for. I mean, anybody of any age, really.
Absolutely. If you look at the magazines now, it looks like it was done by somebody of very limited means and intelligence, because any 12-year-old, 10-year-old with access to a computer can do so much better with desktop publishing tools.
Mm-hmm.
There were things that just no longer exist, like what's press type, where you would rub down letters to get fancy logos of things.
Mm-hmm.
And we did them awkwardly and often badly, but we did them, which was kind of amazing for the time.
Yeah. I actually, my day job is at an advertising agency, and last night we had a function at my office, and one of the art directors in my office was talking to somebody, and she was like, "Oh, so do you do everything on the computer, or do you do some stuff in the physical space too?" And I feel like our art director didn't even know how to answer that, because I don't think she's ever really done an ad or even knew how to do an ad in like a physical space. And it's interesting how there's like, we're kind of almost losing the ability to do things like that to a degree because computers have taken it over, but it makes sense. It does make it way easier. It's just kind of a fascinating thing, but.
Well, we don't know most of us don't know how to make a fire anymore.
Yeah. Thankfully, I was a Boy Scout, so I can do that very well.
Well, that may be an Alaskan kind of thing. In New York, growing up in the city, you kind of lost touch with all those things that were like out there, real world survival stuff, because we kind of thought that the food showed up magically in cans because it was manufactured that way in a factory.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't understand much about this idea of farming or hunting or surviving in the woods growing up. But in much of the country, there's just things you don't know anymore.
Yeah.
And you don't need to. Mm-hmm. So we've lost something in not knowing how to kern type and how to use a T-square to get a paste up right and the lovely smell of rubber cement in the morning. But I think we'll survive.
For sure, for sure. So when you started on these fanzines and you were getting into them and everything like that, did you have designs on working in comics at all, or is it just like this is how you express your fandom of comics?
Pure fandom. I mean, the comic book industry was choking itself to death at that point. It was really a fairly horrible period for the industry, and no, there was no reason to. At a fairly early point, I realized I could get work in the field if I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the New York area fans of my generation got at least a try at being in the business. Um, and I said, all right, that might not be a bad way to pay my way through school, but I had no intention of staying.
What did you actually want to do?
At When I started the fanzine, I was thought of myself more as a science geek. I toyed with the idea of being a chemical engineer, but then I smelled what a chemical lab smelled like.
Mm-hmm.
I went to college. NYU had a 5-year master's, bachelor's program in business, and if I had to guess what I thought I would be, I would have been a manager for a company like IBM, whatever the tech industry was beginning to be at that moment.
Mm-hmm. So from what I understand, it sounds like basically, like you were saying, like anybody in the New York area that was a fan had like perhaps an opportunity if they wanted it to work in comics. But your time at DC started at 16 when you stopped to gather news, and DC's editor Joe Orlando brought you on to help out first in freelance and then as like an assistant editor. But one of the things I'm curious about is, you said that it was an opportunity to help you like get through school and everything like that. But were you excited about that, or is it so commonplace at that point that you were just kind of like, sure, this is an opportunity, might as well take it?
No. It was really cool. I mean, I loved comics. It was a chance to get to know all the people in the field whose work I had grown up on and loved. It was a chance to be a pro.
Mm-hmm.
A much brighter line distinction between being a fan and a pro in those years, because the professional comics had massively greater circulation, paid an honest middle class income at least,
Mm-hmm.
and were at least professionally, physically produced, whereas in those years, fanzines didn't have the tools to do any of those things. So even though there were some wonderfully talented people doing fan work, they weren't getting paid meaningfully. They weren't reaching any meaningful number of people, and their work was generally printed in a fairly horrible fashion.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a chance to be on the other side of the line, which was fabulous. It just wasn't something that I thought was going to be a life's work.
Right. Yeah. That certainly changed. I do. One of the things I thought was really interesting about when you came in is like you officially started at DC as a full-time employee when you became an editor right before you turned 20. And honestly, I don't even know what I was doing at 20. It was not as interesting as that, but that was also right around the time that Jenette Kahn came on as publisher at DC. It was a really interesting time in comics. If you like, I've read varying books about the history of comics, and it's kind of like right as the direct market was starting to become a thing, newsstand market was kind of winding down a bit. There was a lot of interesting things happening. What was that time like, both at DC and in comics in general? Did it feel like a period of transition even then?
It's a little too early to be a transition. The direct market had started. There were a handful of comic shops, but the direct market in '76, which is the moment you're asking about,
Mm-hmm.
was really tiny
Right.
in its economic impact. So the real focus on the business was that the newsstand was dying.
Mm-hmm.
And the fear was very profound that comics were going to die with it.
Mm-hmm.
There was a little bit of hope starting to bloom in '76 in the management turnover at both Marvel and DC. Jim Galton had arrived at Marvel, who was the first outside business person who was both honest and intelligent to run Marvel,
Mm-hmm.
and came out of a real publishing background. And Jenette arrived at DC, who was virtually a Martian by the standard comic industry. She was young, she had never been in comics, and she was a girl. We'd not seen anything like that really in the history of the field. So there was some feeling of hope and uncertainty. No one saw how to find the way out, but suddenly at least there were some people who weren't counting the days till their retirement who might help lead us out. And that was exciting. And there were a lot of bright and talented young people who loved comics, who were becoming more and more active in the field. And we wanted to do good stuff.
Yeah.
And we all liked each other. We all played cards with each other. The more athletic ones played volleyball or baseball with each other. And we talked an awful lot about, what the future would be.
Mm-hmm.
My card game that I played in on Friday nights, the regulars were Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, Jim Shooter, Tom DeFalco. Occasionally you had Chris Claremont or Frank Miller drop by.
Mm-hmm.
Denny O'Neil was pretty regular. Marty Pasco, other names you'd be less likely to know offhand. You had a group of people there who would end up being creative leaders in the field.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the time you played cards and you bullshitted like everybody else does. But you also talked about what comics could be, what we wanted comics to be, and what it might take to get us there.
Yeah. I read about the poker night, and I thought that was super interesting. And I have to ask a question about it. Was there somebody who was particularly good at cards? Was there like a notable poker guy who you're just like, come on, you're winning again? Come on. I just feel like it's Frank Miller. I don't know why I feel like Frank Miller would be good at cards.
Yeah, no, Frank didn't show up often enough to get tarred that way.
Yeah.
Denny was probably a little bit better as a real poker player than most of us.
Mm-hmm.
I think I came out ahead on net over time. Jack Abel, whose name you might know as an inker, later a proofreader for Marvel,
mm-hmm.
Was sort of the oldest guy at the table most of the time. Al Milgram, a longtime inker, later an editor at Marvel for a while.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anybody was conspicuously much better. Roger Slifer, who was the writer who co-created Lobo, probably was most careful to win because there were a couple of years there where the poker game was probably half his income.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't much of an income. It was coloring one Marvel book a week and winning $25 at poker, maybe.
I do think it's funny that we have, like, it seems like often amongst fans, at least, there's this perception of, like, DC versus Marvel. But especially during, like, when both were in New York, there was a lot of overlap. I mean, I think the famous softball game started right around when you joined up at DC, right?
Yeah, it's about the same period. Because there were enough young people to do it.
Yeah.
There was famously the Flegel gang of young creatives in the 50s. Frazetta and Nick Meglin, a bunch of their friends who used to play softball or stickball. But the league kind of softball stuff started up in the 70s.
Mm-hmm. I don't know why I've always kind of imagined, I have like this headcanon about those games. I just imagine John Romita Jr. was incredible. He just seems like a person who'd be good at baseball. I don't know why.
Plus he's fucking built like an athlete. If he's not good at it, I'd be shocked because he sure looks like he could take most of us with one hand tied behind his back.
Absolutely. It's funny. I have a friend who's Italian, and he would always be the first of my friends who were picked for any sport when we were in high school because he just looks like this guy who is like an Adonis, and he cannot do anything in sports at all. He's just an abject disaster. And it's really funny because every person who drafts him or picks him up, they're like, oh yeah, we're totally gonna crush. We got this guy. And then they're so disappointed when they actually get him.
We had a few players along the way.
What's that?
We had a few good players along the way. Bob Rozakis, who was our production manager for a lot of years, was pretty solid, and he recruited some fairly decent people.
Oh, that's awesome. I just think that stuff is so fun, especially like I said in the prism of like the perception amongst especially modern fans. But like there's always like a versus element to it. But really, it's just like you guys. There's a lot of overlap. You knew each other. You hung out in the same circle. You understood your worlds, and so you play softball or poker or whatever together.
I've got 30 years of Marvel comics in my collection. I learned more about writing from Stan and Roy's work than I did from any particular DC writer. It's the superhero stuff is all one world creatively. There was a little more separation from the people who did the remaining Funny Animal books or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the superhero world was basically one environment.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask. I mentioned Jenette Kahn. I wanted to actually ask about her because as I was researching, for this interview, one of the things that really kind of struck me is I don't really feel like her impact on DC and comics in general really gets talked about as much as it maybe should. Do you feel like her impact has somehow gotten underrated over the years and like what she did at DC?
Well, I think there's two things that tend to dilute the appearance of Jenette's major contributions to the field. One is the fact that she hasn't stayed active or very visible in comics since leaving, and so she doesn't have new stuff to hawk. And of course, everybody's reputation has somewhat of a half-life to it.
Mm-hmm.
The other is because the two of us worked as a team for so many years. There's often things where excuse me, where I've gotten more of the credit for things that were either her initiative or that were both of our work, because I have stayed around and been as visible as I have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that type of stuff happens on the creative side too, where it's like attribution can be difficult because we don't really know how everything happened. And so it's like something that may have been Jenette or may have been you, like it gets lost in the translation over the years, and maybe it starts becoming both of you or more one of you than it actually was. It's kind of fascinating how that works out though. But I did want to talk really briefly about Legion, just because I find it really fascinating that you actually you followed Jim Shooter in that book, right?
Yeah, Jim's second run.
Okay. Yeah, I just think it's funny that it's like, it seems like Legion, like two of the more famous runs were Jim's run and your run, and you followed him, and he was also a teen wonderkind. He came on, like his story about coming into comics was, he came on as a teenager as well. He wasn't writing, when in his second run, he wasn't a teenager anymore, I don't believe. But from what I understand, you were a big Legion guy growing up. What was that particularly meaningful for that to be one of your first big opportunities as a writer because you like them so much?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was the book I loved most, the book I collected most energetically early on. When Jim dropped it, I would have probably killed anyone in the hall. And Denny needed a writer who actually knew who the characters were, because he was editing it and he'd never paid much attention to the Legion. He wasn't familiar with it. So he was very happy to take me on. But if anybody had been vying with it, there really would have been violence.
Good thing there wasn't. Jeez. I have a theory about the Legion, and you probably know far better than I do, but it seems like Legion can sometimes be a hard group of characters to get right. And I don't know why that is. It seems like, and maybe it's just because sometimes maybe they just seem like they haven't been as successful over like the last like 15 or so years. And I don't know if that's because they're more difficult to get right, or maybe they're of a certain era or something like that. But do you have any thoughts on that? I know you're a big Legion guy, so I feel like you would know things about this.
Well, I certainly didn't do as well on my third run as I did on my second. So I represent part of the problem. I think a piece of the challenge is what is most wonderful about the Legion was very specific to the time and world it was created in.
Mm-hmm.
Legion was born in a time when comics were for kids, and kids like reading aspirationally. If you're 8 or 10 years old, you like the idea about of reading about people who are 16 or 18, because boy, life will be wonderful when I get that old.
Right.
That was one of the great strengths of the Legion. The science fiction richness of it was one of the great strengths of the Legion. It's a little tougher to do science fiction today, I think, than it was 10 or 15 years ago, because living in an era where so much has already happened and where it's harder to extrapolate what the next steps are going to be, and to make that both fascinating and feeling realistically possible at the same time. And an awful lot of what used to be unique about the Legion exists in other fictions now. Star Wars has the massively different worlds with individuals with different sets of powers and different situations and weird-looking aliens. So some of the turf has been occupied by others. I still think it's possible to do it really well, and to capture an audience. We'll see what the next guy or gal doing it does.
Yeah. It is just kind of interesting. I hadn't really thought about how like the aspirational element has like somewhat changed. I wonder if there's like a certain element of the fact that Legion always kind of felt, to a degree, there was like a hopeful element. There was an aspirational element to it.
Absolutely.
And so now, like, you know, there was a bit of a change where comics became more adult. And so once they became more adult, maybe there was like a change in like the perception of what Legion meant and how it fit and everything else. I don't know. It's an interesting book to me for that reason. You could almost look at Fantastic Four in the same way. It's like, how do these books that were very much of a time grow up to fit modern times? And I don't know.
It's a fair question to ask about any number of things. I agree with you that FF is another conundrum that way. With Legion also, to the point you were talking about, Legion was very much developed in the classic golden age of science fiction, optimistic view of the future.
Right.
The U.S. model of the time, God knows what our model is this week, will reach out and will take over the universe. By the 21st century, an awful lot of successful science fiction was dystopian, not utopian.
Right.
And maybe the Legion doesn't work as well in that.
Yeah. It's a tough group of characters to have in a dystopia. Yo, everybody. Just want to take a second for a quick word from our friends at Comixology Originals. They're launching a line of exclusive original comics with 4 new titles available for free for members of Amazon Prime, Kindle Unlimited, or Comixology Unlimited. They include Savage Game, a graphic novel from the mind of NFL player Ryan Khalil, the return of Richard Starking's Elephant Man, the action-packed Ask for Mercy, and Super Freaks, a perfectly bingeable superhero mystery that has all 5 issues available right now. All can be found on the previously mentioned services, a la carte on Kindle and Comixology, as well as a print version of Savage Game through Amazon.com. Get on these exciting comics today and look for another wave of titles to be announced this summer. And now, back to the show. So I want to get back to, your path and everything. One thing I did want to mention, this is just a quick aside. I was astounded that by the time you were 22, you'd taken over the Batman line, which is kind of astonishing. But shortly thereafter, you were in a unique position to almost create your own job at DC, where it basically became a mashup of editorial, management, sales, a little bit of everything. Like, how did that come together, and why was that something that fit you so well?
Well, Jenette had been splitting the company with Saul Harrison, who was a production guy from the very beginning of comics. He literally worked on the color separations for Action 1 and had been involved in the field ever since. Saul retired at the end of 1980, and Jenette inherited the company as president and publisher. And she's a brilliant woman, very creative, very talented, great project manager. She doesn't like detail management. She doesn't like numbers particularly. She can read a balance sheet or a profit statement as well as anybody, but it's not the sort of stuff she enjoys doing. She likes focusing on specific tasks and projects. Um, this Frank Miller guy seems to be the most interesting creative person in comics today. I'm going to figure out how we get him here and how we do something with him that's never been done before.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a lot that Saul had been doing that was very operational. The comic industry did not have much of a bench of business people, barely any. And our parent company didn't have a lot of interest in the comic business.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't a lot of faith that it was a decent business or that there was anything much you could do with it. So Jenette and I had been working together for 5 years then. We worked together very closely. She had a lot of confidence in me, misplaced or otherwise. And it was just sort of, well, why don't we let the kid give it a try?
Mm-hmm.
So I inherited the responsibility for the business side of the company. And we went from there. So for the next 30 years, I was either what in modern terms you would call the chief operating officer of the company, or then when Jenette left, the chief executive.
Mm-hmm. So were you still doing editorial work at all, or was it just pure business side at that point?
I gave up editing individual titles.
Mm-hmm.
I was, the first year or so, I guess, I was still managing the editorial deadlines to some extent, and traffic less so.
Mm-hmm.
From about 81 to 89, technically the editorial department didn't report to me, but I was out because I was responsible for the marketing of the product and I was a creative person in the field. Certainly I was involved in the processes,
Mm-hmm.
and Dick Giordano, who was managing it, was a great ally and partner in business and part of our management team. So we were all back and forth, Jenette, Dick, me, Joe Orlando, who was handling our special projects.
Mm-hmm.
In those, we were the leadership team of the company. In 89, we shifted and I picked up the publisher title, and at that point the editorial department began officially reporting to me.
Mm-hmm.
But even my belief was that the editorial leaders of the individual imprints, the individual projects, should really be the voice of the individual things. Jenette set an overall set of goals and philosophies for the company, and I tried to keep the joint running.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to talk about a few things in specific during that period, just because they've had some substantial impacts on the industry carrying forward. One of the things, and this is like the thing that from the interviews I read with you, it seems like you almost have the most pride in, is you helped develop the contracts that gave DC creators royalties and a stake in their own work, which, to this day is like a huge feather in DC's cap and is something mentioned often by creators. Like, why was that such an important project for you?
There's an old Russian joke from the Soviet Union days. They pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. And that was kind of the comic book industry I came into in the early 70s. The creative people felt that they were not getting a fair shake, so they were doing it by rote. It's not that they didn't work, but one guy would say, "Well, I won't create any new villains.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just use the existing villains of the character. I'll use the existing supporting characters." Different people had different compromises they'd made in their own head, and the work really suffered. It also was not right. It wasn't good business. It wasn't good creativity. And being able to play an important role in that transition is one of the things I'm proudest of in my career.
Mm-hmm.
And the contract forms that we developed in the mid-70s, much of that got incorporated into many, many contract forms across the industry, still to today. And when we were able to introduce royalties in 80 or 81, for the first time as a standard practice. You go back to the beginning of comics, there were individual creators who had participation deals from the very first. That pretty much died out after the early 1940s. For time. But there had never been a company that just sort of said, no, you work here. If the work succeeds, you will benefit along with us.
Mm-hmm.
You will get what we believe is a fair share. It's always hard to argue what number is fair in anything, but zero just isn't a fair number.
Right. It does seem interesting. I mean, it's hard to say exactly what the impact was immediately, but it does seem interesting that, when I look back at the 80s for DC, that was one of the strongest times in the history of superhero comics for any publisher. Like, the 80s was an absolutely phenomenal time that led to some really exciting stuff. I mean, obviously you can look at like Dark Knight Returns, Watchmen, Year One, New Teen Titans, Man of Steel, Crisis, everything like that. But I mean, it was a really amazing decade. And I there's part of me that wonders if there was a correlation there, if there was a connection to like, sorry, go ahead.
Absolutely a correlation. And it's not just DC, because I mean, Marvel followed us very quickly to be competitive,
Mm-hmm.
Which was frustrating from a competitive standpoint, but great from a long-term health of the business standpoint. You wouldn't have gotten 17 years of Chris Claremont on X-Men if Chris hadn't been earning royalties.
Right.
He would have left to go on and do other things. Remember that in the pre-royalty era, one project paid as well as another.
Mm-hmm.
If you were Chris writing X-Men or Marv writing Teen Titans, and you'd written a year or two of it, and you were a little bored, and somebody flashed a shiny object in front of you, so, all right, I'll try that now. But it was royalties that really locked people into the things.
Mm-hmm.
I like to argue, and I believe it to be true, that in many, many cases people worked harder, put more creative work in, did better stuff as a result, but at the very least they stuck around. And that's a big part of what succeeded. When you look at the growth and survival of the comic shops, X-Men played a disproportionate role in the growth of the comic shops because it was the dominant title through the 1980s and early 1990s, when the shops went from being really a tiny part of the business to being a massive part. And the connective tissue in that success is really Chris.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, X-Men was what got me into comics, and from there, obviously, I've spread quite a bit. But at the same time, like, X-Men was that, and with that royalty deal, I mean, I'm sure Chris had no interest in leaving X-Men because it was so, it was a massive hit. Not the least of which reason was because Chris's work.
Yeah.
So one other thing that you did was, from what I understand, you helped build up the direct market as the newsstand market was starting to fall apart. What did you do exactly? Like, what was your role in that whole side of things?
Well, one was, the marketing and the distribution and the business of DC was my responsibility, and this was our future as far as we were concerned.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't do it alone. There were many people involved. Jenette, our key marketing people over the years, Bruce Bristow, who was our first marketing head, Bob Wayne, who was our longtime head of sales and marketing, who came out of the comic shop world. It's a comic shop retailer. Many, many other people who worked hard and put lots of years in on it. But I guess the key things we did, we invested heavily in the distribution system by giving better discounts to the distributors, but doing it with requirements that they do things that we felt built their companies into better partners.
Mm-hmm.
We reached out a lot to the shops themselves. We did things like running annual sales meetings that we'd fly 100 or so of the key retailers, either by size or by opinion leader or just smart qualities, in to talk about the line and talk about what we were doing and learn from them and show them what we were doing. We'd do those every year for many, many years. And just trying to be a good partner to these growing businesses.
I don't know if you read it, but Dan Gurino wrote this book called Comic Shop that was about the growth of direct market. And, reading about that time and like the impact of people like, everyone you just talked about, and also like Carol Kalish over at Marvel was just like, it was astonishing the importance that you all played in bringing the direct market to the point where it is, where it became what it became. Obviously there was a lot of problems in the 90s, but I feel like the success, like everything that's survived past that, was built on the strength of what you guys were working on in the 80s even.
Well, we had the good fortune to be at one of the strongest players in the game, not only in terms of the size volume that a company like DC does, but we had rich parents.
Yeah.
We had the ability to invest in the future in a way that an independent publisher could not dream of.
Mm-hmm.
And in those early days, the distributors who existed in the business didn't have a lot of capital, didn't have a lot of ability to invest, didn't have a lot of ability to build their businesses. They added some warehouses, they added staff. I don't need to say they didn't do anything, but it was very challenging. And then and now, individual retailers in this business are not of a scale to be able to do a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So having a good partner who actually had a solid checking account made a big difference.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it was also like there were so many, distributors back then, and a lot of them, I don't remember the name of it, but there was this one group in California who was a couple of like teenagers, just like you were when you got into it, and they were running a distribution house. And it's just like, it was the Wild West back then. So I'm certain that they needed the help you guys offered. But, one other thing I wanted to mention was, from what I understand, you played a part basically in the development of the trade paperback and graphic novel with The Dark Knight Returns and its collection. That was, while there were graphic novels before then, I think the first, like the one that everyone says is the first, is Will Eisner's The Contract with God. There are other ones past that, but Dark Knight Returns was the one who really kind of was like a proof of concept for the idea. What role did you play in that, and why was making that collection a big deal such an important thing for you and your team?
Well, what hadn't happened up until that point was any real publisher publishing a sequential comic book story as a collection.
Mm-hmm.
You'd had Jack Katz's The First Kingdom put together by Simon & Schuster in a pretty awkward format, but it wasn't the complete story, so you couldn't read all of it. Yeah. And you'd had some success in the marketplace with things like Origins of Marvel Comics, which were really the equivalent of the old reprint giants, just done as trade paperbacks.
Mm-hmm.
Random stories. Dark Knight was the first time anybody put out a trade paperback or a hardcover, we did it in both formats, that was just, here, this is a book. This is something you can read. This is worthy. It is equivalent. Yes, it was first published as a serial in comics, but Dickens was first published as a serial.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean you think of Tale of Two Cities as a magazine story.
Right.
We did a unique deal to co-publish it with our sister company, Warner Books, where DC put the book together, but put it together into what you would now call two variants. One variant that Warner Books took to the bookstore market,
mm-hmm.
and went out with a massive distribution for the time of 70,000 copies.
Mm-hmm.
And then we did an edition for our variant for the comic shops. Again, when we talk about proof of concept, that showed that you could crack through to a wider audience.
Mm-hmm.
Additionally, we immediately built it into a program. So we were able to follow that with Watchmen, The Shadow, Camelot 3000, one of my Legion stories, other things. And we kept these books in print.
Mm-hmm.
They continued to be available, particularly to the comic shops in those early days, so that you had these things ready to introduce a new customer. One of my goals as a publisher, as a fan, was that if you walked into a record shop in those days, you could get Mozart, or you could get the Beatles, or you could get whoever that year's hot act was.
Hmm.
If you went to a bookstore, you could get Agatha Christie or John Grisham. Comic shops, if you wanted the classic stuff, you had to buy it back issue, great markup prices, dusty old copies too,
Yeah.
and not necessarily readily available. You had to desperately want it to track it down.
Hmm.
I wanted there to be a format where you could get the great stuff easily. The first couple of attempts I made in my business career failed. We tried an album format, like the French albums,
Hmm.
Archie Goodwin and Walt Simonson's Manhunter.
Was it larger size like the albums are?
Yeah, it was 8.5 by 11 album,
Okay.
with a small press that actually Roger Seifer, who I mentioned earlier,
Hmm.
was heading at the time, and it didn't work even in the comic shops. And then we tried a series of what we call Baxter paper offset reprints of some things like the New Gods and Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and they sold a few copies, but it couldn't stay. It couldn't stay available. It just came and it went again. And it really was the trade paperback that cracked through.
Hmm. Yeah, and it seems like those previous experiences kind of informed what you ended up doing with Dark Knight Returns because, it told you that maybe the format needs to be more comic-like, and it also told you that keeping it in print is going to be a very essential element of finding that success.
There was a lot of that. There was a lot of learning from the book industry.
Hmm.
Bruce Bristow, who I mentioned earlier, as our marketing guy at the time, was a major influence on the Dark Knight collection decisions initially. We had the advantage of a story that ran in Rolling Stone, which was very unusual press for comics to get at that point. And he figured out how to run some advertising in conjunction with it that helped market it. A lot of different things came together.
Yeah.
And of course, Frank's work and Klaus's was extraordinary. It was an extraordinary moment.
Yeah.
And
Right book, right time, right project.
yep,
I just have a couple more questions about your past, and I wanted to ask about. We're actually on the 25th anniversary of Vertigo, and Vertigo, while obviously not the same as Dark Knight Returns, it was kind of an extension of like the adult, more like the adult-oriented stories that fit into the comic book format. I know Karen Berger came on a few years after you, and you were deeply involved in inner workings of Vertigo Comics when it launched. Like, why was that a thing that you guys needed to put together then? And what made it such a special thing?
well, we'd experimented with the imprint idea previously with Piranha. We knew that comics were a wonderful medium to tell more kinds of stories than were being told.
Mm-hmm.
And we wanted to see that happen to attract more audiences, grow the business, grow the industry. We tried Piranha. Didn't quite work. Some really interesting work didn't quite come together. Karen, at the meantime, had begun to edit a number of titles that really had a very distinct creative flavor. It began to be joked about in the halls as the Burgerverse. And we turned to her and said, you want to make an imprint out of this? And we then went through a lot of discussions about how best to market it, how best to position it. The creative success of it is really hers. She, as an editor, wasn't a comics person starting out. She grew to love the medium, but she wanted to tell a different kind of story, different kinds of stories. And her taste and her great ability to identify and develop new writers really built that into something that had tremendous outreach.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is kind of astonishing, like all the relationships that she has and had back then. Like the British invasion, I guess, kind of started in like the mid 80s, I guess, more with Alan Moore coming on and everything like that. But it was like all those people who came on in the late 80s and early 90s that formed the kind of foundation of Vertigo is just kind of it's an astonishing wave of talent. But I did want to ask about you became DC's president and publisher in 2001. That was the role you had until you left, I believe. You had a very versatile position to begin with. I'm kind of curious, like how did that promotion change your role? Was it significantly different, or was it just kind of like it just seemed like you from the time that Jenette like empowered you to do your own thing, you had a big role. How different was it for you?
Well, the major change when Jenette left, obviously there were some things we had done together for a long time in terms of the core policies or managing upward to the parent company. We'd both been involved in that for many years. But the major change was that Jenette had been the hands-on person for the creative of the film and TV stuff. I had done the deals and the contracts and all of that, the business stuff, but she was the one working with the directors and the showrunners and things like that. Once in a while, I'd be invited into those meetings because it was a property I knew well, or she wanted to pick my brains on something. But she was really the driving force in that. So when she left, it was sort of, okay, you're responsible for all this Hollywood stuff now, whether it's something you love or not.
Mm-hmm.
You learn it, do it, make it work. And I had the great luck and the great fun of then getting to play with Chris Nolan for a bunch of years on just that incredible series of movies.
Yeah, that's amazing. So that was like one of the big differences is like it also brought Hollywood onto your doorstep effectively.
Yep.
Wow. Yeah, that's a good time to do it. I mean that trio of films
Yeah.
really kind of set the bar. So you know, let's move to the present. You're no longer at DC. I know you've been teaching and working on some books about history of comics, but you're also, you know, the trade for your Dark Horse Presents series Brooklyn Blood with artist Tim Hamilton is coming out next month, and I have to say, I had never experienced Tim's work. I just wanted to make this a quick aside. That guy is a heck of a talent. He's good.
He is indeed a very talented man and a very dedicated one. He was riding his bike all around Brooklyn to the scenes I would throw at him to get the reality of it.
Yeah. He has I don't know, he's got some like Eduardo Riso like inky like qualities to him that are just pretty astonishing. And I know he's been doing comics for a while. It's kind of sad that I'd never actually experienced his work before, but I was reading it and I was just like some of these parts I'm like they're so moody. He's like what a storyteller this guy is. But so this is a story that's set in your hometown where you're born, about a police case and its intersection with supernatural and some elements of Brooklyn history, which I thought was super fascinating. It was a great, engrossing read. What were the origins of the ideas, and what made it a story you wanted to tell?
Well, the two prose fiction areas I read most are detective stories and science fiction. I've done a lot of science fiction in my life. I haven't had a chance to do detective stories previously. I've done some mysteries in the Legion and elsewhere, but you know, it's still within a science fiction structure. I loved things like Ed McBain's 87th Precinct series, and I wanted to play in that world.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, I want to do that. I want to do it in New York because it's a rich storytelling environment and it's a place I know well so that I can use the history, I can use the actual geography effectively. Within that, all right, so Brooklyn is cool these days. Wasn't when I was a kid,
Mm-hmm.
and I point out very energetically. Okay, so if I'm going to do the story in Brooklyn, where in Brooklyn, what in Brooklyn? And in thinking about it, I realized that some of the worst deaths and disasters in New York City history not only all happened in Brooklyn, but happened within a very, very short distance of each other in Brooklyn by coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. What does that mean? How do I make that into a story?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the heart of the genesis of Brooklyn Blood. Everything else built out from there.
Was there a part of you that kind of wanted to do a story just specifically that was set in your old neighborhood, effectively? You know, back in Brooklyn. Was there a part of you that was interested in that?
Well, I was interested in doing it in New York because I knew and loved New York. The part of Brooklyn that the story is set in isn't the part I grew up in. It's an area that I've spent a lot of time in, and as an adult,
Mm-hmm.
my daughter lived in part of it for a while. I've had friends living there. Chris Claremont's in the area where a lot of the story takes place. Other friends of mine, but you start with a little piece of a story, and then it leads you where it wants to go.
Yeah.
And once I found all these deaths, morbidly enough, that was what was pulling me in that direction.
Mm-hmm. I think it's funny that you phrase it like that, because that just reminds me of the part during the story where the partners are actually going to Queens, and she's like, well, why are we going here? It's not even Brooklyn anymore. And he's like, it's just the right place to go. We got to go. I would say that the one part of the book that made me sad, as much as I enjoyed the overall thing, I mean, sad from a reader standpoint, is he threw some shade at Brooklyn Nine-Nine. I love Brooklyn Nine-Nine. It's enjoyable. Although I guess that fit the character.
I got nothing against Brooklyn Nine-Nine, but I'm betting a real cop working out of the 78th precinct probably doesn't appreciate it too much.
Probably not. No, it's probably not a very authentic look at how detectives in a Brooklyn-based police outfit would actually work, but still very enjoyable. Was there one thing I'm curious about is the way that Dark Horse Presents works is like, I don't know how many pages the average, it's like seeming like 5 to 8 pages or so.
Well, the story was running 8 pages a section.
Okay.
And basically 8 pages a month, which is an awfully difficult structure for this kind of. So, and also Dark Horse Presents, anthologies don't have enormous circulation.
Mm-hmm.
So my assumption is that not much of anyone has read this story yet. And I'm hoping they will come to it in the trade paperback and say, all right, let me read a good detective story. And Tim did a gorgeous cover for it.
Oh, yeah.
That I think makes it look like it belongs in the mystery section of a bookstore as well as in the graphic novel section.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thrilled to get a nice quote out of Brad Meltzer for the front cover, who's one of the more successful authors in that space. So I'm hoping all those things will serve as invitations for people to try it and say, oh, all right, this is fun.
Yeah.
And maybe we can more regularly have people creating graphic novels in that genre in the future. It's been done before, but not a lot.
Mm-hmm. Was there any difficulty like writing for that format while also kind of making it work in trade? Because it is interesting. It's like with each of those 8-page sections, you want to have like a hook by the end, like a reason for people to read the next one. But in trade format, it like reads completely differently. Was that, did you go back and try to smooth any edges, or is that just how how it played out?
No, it was deliberate. It's a challenge, but when you're writing a prose mystery novel, or even a prose novel in general, I think you want a punchline to your chapter.
Right.
It's not necessarily a Perils of Pauline moment where someone's about to get run over by the train.
Right.
You want something that both satisfies the reader, but that also invites them into the next.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm certainly trying to do that with each chapter. Again, we'll leave it up to the readers whether I've succeeded or not.
Right. It is a tricky balance. I mean, that was one of the interesting things I thought about the book was you have a blend of like more fantastical elements with like the grounded nature of a police story. Like those two interests you had, sci-fi and like a little bit of fantasy mixed in with, real police drama. And there's also like PTSD for the main character. But it easily could have fallen apart if it like went even too far in like one of the directions. Did you have like, as you're writing, is there a specific guiding light you have to like make it all work? Like, are you really a character driven writer, or how did you approach it?
I'm a plot driven writer.
Okay.
A character has to define whatever you do, but I'm a structuralist by nature.
Mm-hmm.
So, when I came up with the original thing, I built basically a grid of, originally I thought it would be 15 chapters. We played around with it a little bit, developed the ending. Some ideas that Tim had along the way got incorporated too. And I just gridded out what the major developments of the 15 chapters would be, and what would happen to each of the major characters at which points.
Mm-hmm.
That was the skeletal structure of the thing,
Right.
and that's where I start from as a writer.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it is interesting all the different ways you can approach writing, but that, like, you have to know where you're going and how you're going to get there to actually tell the story if you're going to structure it out. I did want to ask, I mentioned how much I enjoyed Tim's work on it. How did you two partner up, and like what made him the right fit for telling this story?
Well, one of my challenges is that when editors ask me who I'm interested in having draw my stories, I have to kind of admit most of the artists I've worked with in my career are somewhere between old and dead. Because I'm 40 odd years into the business. So I don't know the younger talent nearly as well as I knew my generation.
Mm-hmm.
I sat down with friends of mine who belong to the current generation and said, this is the kind of story I want to tell who'd be good.
Mm-hmm.
And my buddy Christine Norrie, who's an Eisner-nominated cartoonist herself from over the years, very talented lady, suggested Tim as a possibility. I looked at his work and said, yeah, this could work. Sat down with Tim, told him a little bit about the idea. He thought it was interesting. Obviously, he was going to end up putting in, the better part of a year of his life on it. So it had to be something that he felt was interesting. And pitched him to Dark Horse, and they were okay with it, and we went from there.
Yeah. When it comes to scripting, like how flexible are you on your scripts to like let Tim find the right answers on the page? It's like it seems to me that you've worked with a lot of artists who have written their own comics, so it seems like collaboration is important for how you're going to approach it, right? Like, so how flexible were you?
Well, every project is its own thing,
right?
And each artist has their own preference of how they like to work too. I've worked with artists where I just give them a plot outline. I've worked with artists where I give them a panel by panel plot outline. I've worked with artists where I give them a full script and they never alter anything. They just interpret it.
Mm-hmm.
In Tim's case, we talked through a lot of it originally, got some ideas from him. I wrote full scripts for the chapters. He came back occasionally with ideas of, wait a minute, the way you're breaking that out isn't as exciting as the way I see it. Here's a thumbnail of how I would like to do it. Or, it would be interesting to do this in the next chapter if you think that could work, Paul. And we'd go back and forth. Collaboration is definitely part of the fun of this medium.
Yeah, it seems like you had a real back and forth there, but I don't know. That was one of the things that stood out to me about your writing career is like you'd worked with, recently you worked with Sonny Liu. Keith Giffen is obviously somebody who has done pretty much everything you can do in comics. I mean, it is just like, it's kind of cool. Like some of the people that you've worked with are just, I imagine you've had some pretty incredible collaboration or collaborative experiences in your career as a writer.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I worked with Keith before he realized he was a writer.
Yeah.
But he's got one of the most fertile imaginations ever in comics.
Yeah.
It's some percentage of the ideas are absolutely loony and should never be brought to light. Some percentage of them are incredibly brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
And it's great when you're working with him as a writer also because he has no emotional attachment to the ideas in the sense of you must use my idea. It's just sort of, well, you could do this or you could do that or you could do this other thing over here. I thought about this. Might be a little strange, but what about the ceiling? And we had great fun. Sonny is just an amazingly smart guy and a brilliant writer in his own right. Charlie Chan Hak Chai is a gorgeous book.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, you're a hell of a lot better when you're working with guys like that. I mean, I started out with the ridiculous luck that the first comic I created myself, at age 17, I had Steve Ditko and Wally Wood as my collaborator.
Yeah.
I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, that was one of the things that stood out too about when you were obviously not the same type of thing, but when you were doing the comic reader, like some of the people who did covers for that were astonishing. I mean, like Jack Kirby did a cover, like Walt Simonson. I mean, you've had some pretty good experiences with working with some phenomenal artists.
I got to play with almost everybody who I grew up with in the field, one way or another. There's maybe one or two of the artists who I loved as a kid. Mike Sikowski never drew one of my stories. He was out of comics by the time I was writing them. Who else did I miss? I'm not sure. Dick Ayers I never worked with as a writer, but I edited his stuff for many years.
Mm-hmm.
Don Heck I edited. I don't remember if Don ever drew any of my stories, but Kirby, Kane, Infantino, Colin, just Kurt Swan many times, Dick Dillon many times, so many of the classic greats, and so many of the guys of my own generation.
Yeah.
Ridiculously lucky man.
It's awesome. Okay, so last question. I just want to close with something that's, about the overall state of comics. One of the things I always think is really fascinating, and when I was reading some of your old interviews, it's funny how often it seems like there's like a doom and gloom element to comics. It's like at all points, it seems like there's something that people really perceive to be super wrong with them, but yet comics keep persevering. I'm kind of curious, like what. We're in a time where there's a lot of turmoil and topsy-turviness in the way that comics are going. There's a lot of change. It's a period of disruption. What's your take on how comics are doing overall, and now that you have a little bit of distance from the whole thing?
Well, part of it is the question of whether you're talking about comics as a media form or whether you're talking about comics as a business.
Right. I guess a bit of both.
It is, and it's the business side of it that has been endangered many times over the years. As a media form, comics are having a second golden age. There's really never been a period in American comics history with the diversity of interesting creative material that we've got coming out now. It's fabulous and it's accelerating. And I think that's going to continue to grow. As a business, we live in a country that is not incredibly interested in reading, so it's always a bit of an uphill climb.
Mm-hmm.
But we're also living in a time where visual communication is becoming more and more important to people. When you look across the world, comics, in whatever their local form is a much larger part of the publishing industry in much of the world.
Mm-hmm.
In Japan, it approaches 40% of the publishing business. It's down a little bit these days. Maybe it's in the mid-30s. In France, last numbers I saw, it was around 14% of the publishing business. In America, it's been around 3%.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's only been that low because we were only putting out comics in 3 or 4 flavors. Superheroes and adventure comics were really the dominant part of what the media form was. Genre fiction. In the last few years, we've started to do more and more different kinds of things. The incredible success Raina has had, for example.
Yeah.
Each of those things is spreading the borders and bringing more and more people into comics, the media form, and into comics, the business, defined most broadly. Can the comic shops capture the audience that Raina is creating? I think they can. I think they will in the next 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And those kids who are growing up are also the kids who are growing up in love with the emojis, the GIFs, and communicating that way. And I think we're going to see all of that continue to accelerate the growth of comics. They want visual storytelling, and we're the visual storytellers.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things is, we saw a generation who grew up on Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns and Image and all these different things. And then, now we have this generation that's growing up on Raina Telgemeier and Jeff Smith and, Kazu Kibuishi and everything like that. And what will that look like when that group starts making their own comics?
Absolutely. I've always had a great belief in what the medium could be, but I've never had a target of what it should be.
Right.
It should be a place where people can create, and we'll see what stories they have to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about your life, your career, your everything. I really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure, sir.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Paul Levitz. You can find Levitz on Twitter at Paul_Levitz, on his website at paullevitz.com, and his work in the upcoming trade paperback Brooklyn Blood. If you're a fan of the show, check out the show on Patreon. If you back it on there, you not only support the show, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to exclusive written and audio content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Stitcher and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find the show on social media as well. Like the show on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD. Follow on Twitter at @sketchcomic, or follow me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Nick Paletto, Mike DiArgenio, Dylan Campbell, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Michael Garland, Nick, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, David, Jason Massey, Mike Gillis, Adam Bogert, Xavier Files, Maria Schweitzer, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Dan Guarino, Dan Lee, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Evan Blazer, Brian McRae, Ira James Udaskin, Henning Allers, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bruno Batista, Abraham Reisman, Bobby Angus, Bjorn Basin, Darren Neely, John Hendrick, Steve Anderson, Michael Perlman, Phil Nall, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Maxwell Schmidt, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Avino, Nicholas Kesslake, Greg Rucka, Ryan Mail, Adam Heifel, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corgan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Dianakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track outro from their album Volmilch opens and closes the show now. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.